Traditionalism, Catholicism, and Ghibellinism. Queen Elizabeth II was a quite remarkable woman and one of the last surviving ancient and traditional orders of governance known to man. It is an unfortunate time, and I have to say I did mourn her passing, despite not being one of her subjects. It's hard to explain the reaction I had when I heard of the event while I was at work at the 8th of September. I admittedly did enjoy the memes of the Eternal Queen. In retrospect, it was quite childish when I would share such ironic imagery across the internet. As over 100 million of her subjects mourn for the longest reigning monarch in their history, I would ask my audience to respect the loss of which shall change the world as we know it. So I wish to dedicate this essay to her. It is unfortunately fitting with the theme of this essay, though. As the matriarch of the Windsor dynasty leaves this earth, a new patriarch has taken her mantle. King Charles III, long may he reign, and may God grant his favor upon his servant. Introduction. The utopia that is to be discussed is not one of any particular nation, not of any particular form of government in the abstract, for the form of government cannot breed a utopia, as that is placing faith in a temporal institution to deliver a paradise. What I am about to share is an all-encompassing, total reorienting view of the world that rejects the cult of modernism and its tenets, namely liberty, equality, individualism, and the degrading spirit of it. Deracinated from his fellow man and welfare, liberal man has come to only believe in these tenets and not any tenets of anything deeper, such as ethnos, religion, and nation, and loyalty. Through man has conquered nature and views itself above it, that has made man arrogant to the eternal truths of it. Through what is referred to as progress has poisoned the mind of man to believing he is no longer subject to the laws in which the world is governed, for that we have been taken over by the weak-willed and malicious of heart. It is governed not by men of higher purpose, put through the forge of pain and suffering, instead by the stagnation of comfort, the malaise of man. Because of this comfort, he believes himself higher than what he is. He forgets the weakness of his own flesh. Because of this, he fears no God and his natural law. All great men of history were daring men of valor that overcame their pain and conquered. Cowards deny the pain and seek progress to mitigate pain. The metaphysical outlook on the world is in all things political, economic, philosophical, natural, cultural, and moral, or in the German phrase, a Weltanschauung. Leaves no room for opposing ideologies, religions, and political structures in the core tenets of a Weltanschauung. It is hard to put words to what is called, because I am asking man to return to a natural outlook and ways of life that the modern world is destroying at every breath. I'm going to drag men out of the immorality of this age, kicking and screaming, end the hedonism, looking down to the lowest common denominator, earth, and the limited reality. The natural hierarchy will cease to be denied their natural order, and the great men that make history shall be once more. The age of great men shall come against modernity and its materialistic world, looking up from the earth, up to eternity, up to God. The principles to be limited by mere language are as followed: tradition, the view of the world in the eyes of the eternal; Catholicism, the understanding of the universal order over all of man spiritually in the pontiff and the church; Ghibellinism, the universality of temporal leadership in the emperor and the empire. Our ancestors once had a simple name for this order, and it was Christendom. The assumptions that man is is a source of his salvation is a fallacy of the Protestant Revolution. The Protestant schism from the Catholic Church in 1517, the mentality of Western man has been sent on a path of materialization and desacralization of the world, and has removed the metaphysical from the physical, where prior the two were in union in the zeitgeist of the traditional world. For the listener, he may be confused by this line of reasoning, but the unfortunate goal is not of temporal politics, and stands for something far higher than mortal man. For I am appealing to the supernatural and the natural order of things, not man-made constructions of rationalization. The divine is as much present as the temporal, and there is no separation between the planes within the context of Ghibellinism and the actual realities of the world.
Monarchy is the one system of government where power is exercised for the good of all. Aristotle 322-384 BC.
When modern man hears the word tradition, most take the view of antipathy and or the material decor of different cultures, while still believing all peoples are the same and cultures are equal. Modern man has dispensed with the traditions for an anti-culture around the secular worldview who replaces the ritual and supernatural world for the world of material comfort and laissez-faire immorality, justifying everything based upon economics and democratic consensus instead of higher truths and the metaphysical order of the world. The man of tradition is a man who lives beyond his time, and in living legacy that began with the divine origins through him onto his progeny. The traditional man honors his divine vocation, with his caste determined to him not by institutions of man, but that of God. Everything was oriented upwards to the divine, with the monarch at the height of the caste pyramid that represented God on earth as his divine regent. The contrast between the worldviews of traditional and modern man are expressed most clearly by the Italian philosopher and traditionalist writer Baron Julius Evola, in his magnus opus Revolt Against the Modern World, which he initially released in 1934, but then released a revised version in 1969 to update his thought process post the Second World War. For background, in case you know not of Julius Evola, he was an Italian artillery officer in the First World War, studier of ancient cultures and religions across the world, expert on linguistics and political commentary that criticized Benito Mussolini's regime from the traditionalist right-wing worldview, and even published 2 books, Traditionalist Confronts Fascism and Fascism Viewed from the Right. In the open introduction to Revolt Against the Modern World, he says as follows.
In order to understand both the spirit of tradition and its antithesis, modern civilization, it is necessary to begin with the fundamental doctrine of the two natures. According to this doctrine, there is a physical order of things and a metaphysical one. There is a mortal nature and an immortal one. There is the superior realm of being and the inferior realm of becoming. Generally speaking, there is a visible and tangible dimension and, prior to and beyond it, an invisible and intangible dimension that is the support, the source, and true life of the former. Julius Evola.
For translation, all authority doesn't come from the temporal, but the spiritual. All things temporal derive its virility from the spiritual and the eternal. In the spiritual realm of the Christian world, the Almighty and Eternal God is divided into 3 essences in the Divine Trinity. God the Father is the absolute ruler of the eternal paradise, heaven. God the Son is the King of kings, and the last sacrificial lamb offered to heaven for the forgiveness of sins, who was the only union between priest and king. Upon his death, the swords were divided into 2 authorities he once held upon this earth. The first sword is the spiritual sword, the one who is to govern the world spiritually, which fell onto the apostle Peter and his successors in the Holy See, the Roman pontiff, or simply known as the Pope. The temporal sword was rendered to Caesar as the leader of Christendom temporally, as said in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, as, quote, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." The verse refers to the twin authorities, the duality of the world, the principle of throne and altar, the mortal and immortal. The throne is the highest office, second to none, and is the embodiment of the divine on earth. Dante Alighieri, the famous author of Divine Comedy, wrote in his work De Monarchia on chapter 9, saying,
Men, as the sons of heaven, should follow in the footprints of heaven. Likewise, every son acts well and for the best when, as far as his individual nature permits, he follows in the footprints of a perfect father. As man and the son generate man, according to the second book of natural learning, the human race is the son of heaven, which is absolutely perfect in all its works. Therefore mankind acts for the best when it follows in the footprints of heaven, as far as its distinctive nature permits. Now, human reason apprehends most clearly through philosophy that the entire heaven in all its parts, its movements, and its motors, is controlled by a single motion, the primum mobile, and by a single mover, God. Then, if our syllogism is correct, the human race is best ordered when in all its movements and motors it is controlled by one prince as by one mover, by one law as by one motion. On this account it is manifestly essential for the well-being of the world that there should exist a monarchy or unified principality, which men call the Empire, Holy Roman Empire. This truth Boethius sighed for in the words, O race of men, how blessed, did the love which rules the heavens rule likewise your minds. Dante Alighieri de Monarchia.
These two forces ruled and reigned the ancient world, and all were subject to and none outside its confines. All castes from the priestly caste, or those who oriented the civilization upwards to the divine, the warrior caste, or those who are responsible for the protection and leadership of the civilization temporally, the merchant caste, or those who facilitate the production of the civilization, and the peasant class, or those who are oriented to the labor of the civilization. There was a term for medieval Christendom to acknowledge the natural order of the age. The priest prays for all, the knight protects all, and the peasant feeds all. All fills their lot in life, and all are vital for the civilization. But the ones who defend all are also the rulers, for what is a king but a head of the warrior caste, and is firstly responsible for its defense, as said by Niccolo Machiavelli in his Prince.
A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study, than war and its rules and discipline. Niccolo Machiavelli the Prince. There is no salvation apart from Christ and his one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. Again, this is an infallible teaching and not up for debate among Catholics. Catechism of the Catholic Church, Catechism 846.
Modern seculars have come up with a definition for what they call European and Christian civilization, which is referred to them as the West. The word, too, was only invented to describe the civilization only after the secularizing forces of the Protestant schism and the poison of the Enlightenment had taken root in academic minds. The man of tradition in that age knew not the terms the West, but he knew of it as Christendom. Everywhere the empire touched, everywhere the church offered the Mass, everywhere there were Christians was Christendom. For a definition of Christian before the Great Schism of 1053 between Rome and Byzantium, all Christians were considered those who submitted spiritually to the authority of the Roman Pontiff, and the inheritor of St. Peter's place as the Bishop of Rome and head of the Universal Church. There was no such thing as multiple Christian churches. There was only one church, as which Christ intended. The rejection of the coined term, the Enlightenment, is to be fundamentally rejected, and all its theorists who wrote in the period following the wars of religion within Europe caused by the Protestant militancy to destroy the Universal Church and the Holy in the Holy Roman Empire, the wars of religion of note being the 30 Years' War, English Civil War, and Huguenot uprisings. These wars were fundamentally a grand struggle between the universality of the Catholic Church to rule all of Christendom spiritually, which it had for 15 centuries, against the nationally based Protestants who rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and the supranational authority of the Emperor. Julius Evola wrote on this in his book Men Amongst the Ruins, that he wrote after the Second World War in protest to the American and capitalistic world order, released in 1953.
According to the Ghibelline theology, the empire was an institution of supernatural origin and character, like the Church. It had its own sacred nature, just as, during the Middle Ages, the dignity of the kings themselves had an almost priestly nature, kingship being established through a rite that differed only in minor detail from episcopal ordination. On this basis, the Ghibelline emperors, who were the representatives of a universal and supranational idea, embodying a lex animata in terris, a living law on earth, opposed the hegemonic claims of the clergy and claimed to have only God above themselves, once they had been regularly invested with their function. The Ghibelline emperors did not oppose the clergy on the plane of mere political rivalry, as is claimed by the short-sighted historiography that has shaped ordinary education. The political contention was only consequential and occasional in regard to the conflict among dignitates, those in high-ranking offices, that referred to a spiritual plane. During the Middle Ages, the realization of the human personality was believed to consist either in the path of action or in the path of contemplation, the two paths usually referred to the empire and to the Church, respectively. Julius Evola, Men Amongst the Ruins. Further, mankind is a whole with relation to certain parts, and is a part with relation to a certain whole. It is a whole, of course, with relation to particular kingdoms and nations, as was shown above, and it is a part with relation to the whole universe, as is self-evident. Therefore, in the manner in which the constituent parts of collective humanity correspond to humanity as a whole, so, we say, collective humanity corresponds as a part to its larger whole. That the constituent parts of collective humanity correspond to humanity as a whole through the one only principle of submission to a single prince, can be easily gathered from what has gone before. And therefore humanity corresponds to the universe itself, or to its prince, who is God and monarch, simply through one only principle, namely, the submission to a single prince. We conclude from this that monarchy is necessary to the world for its well-being. Dante Alighieri de Monarchia.
Ghibellinism, as to what is to be advocated for, isn't what moderns refer to as an ideology, but a spiritual worldview, or a Weltanschauung. It was the way of life for the greatest civilization ever birthed from the times of the Emperor Charlemagne to the reign of Charles V, until its destruction by the forces of the wicked revolutionaries of France in the Napoleonic War. The divine throne, that of the Emperor, reigned in Christ's name over all the lands of which Christians dealt. His law was that of the higher order, and divine in nature. To oppose the law was not only in defiance to the emperor, but also an offense to God, as Julius Evola wrote in his magnus opus Revolt Against the Modern World, as saying,
As a natural consequence, traditional man either ignored or considered absurd the idea that one could talk about laws and the obedience due them if the laws in question had a mere human origin, whether individual or collective. Every law, in order to be regarded as an objective law, had to have a divine character. Once the divine character of a law was sanctioned and its origin traced back to a non-human tradition, then its authority became absolute. This law became then something ineffable, inflexible, immutable and beyond criticism. Thus, every transgression of such law was regarded not so much as a crime against society, but rather and foremost as sacrilege or as an act of impiety, or as an act that jeopardized the spiritual destiny of the person who disobeyed it as well as of the people with whom that person was socially related. This is why, up to and including medieval civilization, rebellion against authority and the imperial law was considered as serious a crime as religious heresy. Thus the rebels were considered just like heretics, namely, as enemies of their own natures and as beings who contradict the law of their very own being. Aryan India employed a special expression to designate those who broke the caste law. They were called the fallen ones, or the lapsed. The usefulness of the law in the modern sense of the word, that is, its collective and empirical usefulness, was never the true criterion adopted in ancient times. Not that this aspect was never considered, but it was rather thought to be an accessory or a consequential aspect in every law, once a law was sanctioned as true. After all, there are different views of what constitutes usefulness. The notion of usefulness is the ultimate materialistic criterion of modern society, though that was not the case in traditional societies, which rather regarded it as a means to be employed in the function of a higher purpose. But for a law to be considered useful, it was necessary to appear as something other than a mere reliable creation of the human will. Once it was established that its authority originated from above, its usefulness and efficacy were definitely acknowledged. This certainty was never questioned, even in those cases in which experience, in the most immediate and unrefined mean of the word, did not confirm and even prove such a law to be wrong somehow, since as the saying goes, the web of heaven's way is complex and incomprehensible. This is why in the traditional world the creation of a system of laws and rituals was always attributed to divine legislators or to divine mediators. These beings, in turn, were considered as various forms or apparitions of the Lord of the Center, or King of Justice, the forms being determined by different geographical areas and by different populations. And even when in more recent times the electoral system was introduced, tradition retained a partial formal existence when the people's decision was not considered to be sufficient. In that case, in order for new laws to be finally ratified, it was necessary to obtain the approval of the pontifexes and to make sure that the diviners ascertained where these laws enjoyed the God's approval. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world.
As referred to earlier with Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." The Church is parallel and integral to the empire. It exists within the empire, but was not subject to it. The emperor defended the Church and sponsored its growth worldwide, notably Emperor Frederick I, who called the Christian princes to crusade under the banner of the Holy Roman Empire for the benefit not of the empire, but of the Church. For all the moderns who think that the Catholic Church, as an institution that delivered moral platitudes and doesn't perceive its authority, is strictly misguided. The Church is the bridge between the spiritual and temporal. The spiritual authority of the Church is absolute, and there is no other legitimacy but that of Rome. The way it has been since the crucifixion of St. Peter, the order that ruled the European world from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the Protestant Revolution, was the most stable millennia of human history as the society was guided upwards towards the divine. Since the Enlightenment age, all have been looking downwards to the lowest castes and to the earth, and we have suffered for it. We need to look up to the plains of eternity and up to God.
The fact that the feudal world of personality and of action did not exhaust the deepest possibilities of medieval man was proven by the fact that his fides was able to develop in a sublimated form and be purified into the universal. Such was the form that had the empire as its reference point. The empire was perceived as a superpolitical reality, an institution of supernatural origin that formed one power with the divine kingdom. While in the empire the same spirit that shaped the individual feudal and regal units continued to action, its peak was the emperor, who was regarded not as a mere man, but rather as a deus homo totus deificatus et sanctificatus, aderandus quia praesel princeps et summus est. The God-man is completely deified and sanctified, to be worshipped because he is the prince and supreme, according to the characteristic expression of the time. Thus, the emperor embodied the function of a center in the eminent sense of the word and demanded from his subjects and from the feudal lords a spiritual acknowledgement similar to what the Church claimed for herself in order to realize a higher European traditional unity. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world. I look upon the people and the nation as handed on to me as an responsibility conferred upon me by God, and I believe, as it is written in the Bible, that it is my duty to increase this heritage for which one day I shall be called upon to give an account. Whoever tries to interfere with my task I shall crush. Kaiser Wilhelm II.
In any society, as mentioned earlier, you have the traditional castes, even if they are suppressed like in the current modern age. The castes, according to the liberal mind of the Enlightenment, are the production of an unjust hierarchy with the de facto belief in the equality of man, and doesn't take into account the reality or de jure actuality of the human race in its conditions, that there are natural hierarchies of man. The castes of yesteryear were the perennial existence of four fundamental castes of man. The castes following in the line of blood: a warrior will produce a warrior, a peasant will produce a peasant, and a bourgeois will produce a bourgeois. The two natures that informed that relation is the blood of the temporal and the soul of the primordial.
Such was the Indo-Aryan socio-political system, which closely resembled the Persian system. The latter was articulated into the four Pishtra of the Lords of Fire, Athreva, of the warriors, Rathestha, of the heads of the family, Vastri of Shiant, and of the serfs assigned to manual labor, Houthi. An analogous pattern was found in other civilizations up to the European Middle Ages, which followed the division of people into servants, burghers, nobility and clergy. In the Platonic worldview, the castes corresponded to different powers of the soul and to particular virtues. The rulers, the warriors and the workers corresponded respectively to the spirit and to the head, to the animus and to the chest, and to the faculty of desire and to the lower organs of the body regulating sex and the functions of excretion. In this way, as stated by Plato, the external order and hierarchy correspond to an inner order and hierarchy according to justice. The idea of organic correspondence is also found in the well-known Vedic simile of the generation of the various castes from the distinct parts of the primordial man or Purusa. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world.
The priestly caste, otherwise known as the First Estate, for the brevity of this essay, the duty bestowed upon the priestly caste is fundamentally one of the metaphysical plane, beyond the material world, with his role the guiding of the civilization towards the divine, with his eyes ever looking upwards. This is his fides. In Catholicism, the rock on which civilization is laid upon, it is the priestly caste who offers the sacrifice of the Passion of Christ at Mass, where time ceases to be. When the priest hosts the Mass, the divine works through the priest, as Christ did at the Last Supper, making the sacrifice of the body and blood of Christ, and for the demos to take of the flesh of the last lamb in the eternal sacrifice, for the regeneration of the soul. In that moment, the personality of the priest ceases to be of the priest, and standing at the altar is Christ. In the Christian worldview, the priest, as dispenser of the sacramentals, must also cast judgment and punishment for the breakers of the highest law, the divine law. The confession is the trial of one's crimes against God, and his sacred and like a judge dispenses a sentence. A priest dispenses the penance on the severity of the sin and its nature. The warrior caste, otherwise known as the Second Estate, are these men of the vocation of guardian of the civilization, an elite trained in war, and the dispenser of temporal justice. The Second Estate, or those who are oriented to rule from above through divine right, are the caste of which every man, from the chivalric knight to the Holy Roman Emperor, bore for them. Their loyalty was that of a warrior. Through oaths of blood and sacred oaths did they reign. They lived the warrior codes, notably of chivalry. They understood the world and the divine mission of their lives as service. The empire is the ideal of the Second Estate, as the sacramental is to the First Estate. As Julius Evola wrote on his doctrines of the caste as part of Revolt Against the Modern World.
Regarding that kind of social order that had its center in a sovereign and lasted up to the time of the Holy Roman Empire, there survives the principle according to which the subjects may demonstrate their faithfulness to God through faithfulness to their ruler. The view of the subject as a being connected to the person of his sovereign through a sacred and freely chosen vow is an ancient Indo-European view. In the traditional world, this fides or personal devotion went beyond political and individual boundaries, and even acquired the value of a path leading to liberation. Cremant, in reference to Iran, observed that the subjects dedicated to their deified kings not only their actions and words, but their very thoughts. Their duty was a complete abandonment of their personality in favor of those monarchs who were held the equal of gods. The sacred militia of the mysteries was nothing but this civic morality viewed from the religious standpoint. It confounded loyalty with piety. This loyalty, in the brightest and most luminous forms of tradition, was credited with the power of producing the same fruits faith is supposed to produce. Not too many years ago, the Japanese general Nogi, who had prevailed at Port Arthur against his Russian foes, killed himself with his wife after the death of his emperor in order to follow him in the afterlife. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world.
The merchant caste, also called the bourgeoisie, money changers, or usurers, they are many names for the caste of people devoted to the exchange of wares, the entrepreneurs, the bankers, the intellectual class, and the seekers of material wealth with boundless pursuit of freedom to hedonistic levels. This is the caste of non-nobled people that live detached from the physical labor of the peasantry and the reality of the world they live with but doesn't have the prestige of being a member of the warrior nobility of the Second Estate. Their wealth and comfortable lifestyles make this caste the most susceptible to revolutionary and luxury beliefs about the world. Because of their wealth and the fact they typically pay taxes more than a peasant, it develops a narcissism unique to that caste that breeds thoughts of liberation from the orders of the First and Second Estate. Men like Martin Luther and John Calvin were born of this caste in their youths, and they wanted to reject 15 centuries of consistent and insightful theology for their bastardization of Christianity in the Protestant Revolution. Oliver Cromwell, the famous regicider, perpetrator of Charles I, who came from a wealthier bourgeois family that gave him a seat in Parliament. He lived as a wealthy man before the Civil War and carried his beliefs of absolutist anti-Romanism, popular sovereignty, at least for the Third Estate, and the puritanical Old Testament Christianity that the average peasant didn't care for or resisted. John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were bourgeois men who had the wrong understanding of man in the state of nature, which in reality there was never such a situation that they described of social contracts and fundamental good nature of man. The idea that all society should operate on a surrogate religion concept as an inanimate social contract that replaced God and tried to replace it a natural law. In reality, the lone wolf man who abandoned his tribe would either be brutally killed by another tribe or be killed by nature itself. The belief in the equality of man just doesn't exist with a curious glimpse to history, with the endless conquests of superior peoples over inferior peoples, martial cultures destroying non-martial cultures. A country with the ability to commit genocide from 10,000 feet, namely the United States, destroys an industrial inferior and outnumbered foe of greater martial ability, aka Germany and the Japanese Empire. The bourgeoisie are some of the most bloodthirsty of the estates, because of their ideals being that of destruction of any attempt at a moral order. To quote from one of the men I despise the most, Thomas Jefferson, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." This is an intolerable statement from a bourgeois intellectual who never saw a battlefield or volunteered for the front of the revolution he assisted in starting. He also cheered on the bloodshed of within the French Revolution and Robespierre's reign of terror. Robespierre, being a bourgeois lawyer, led the infamous reign of terror that put tens of thousands to death for not supporting the revolution, starting with the martyr king Louis XVI to the beheading of nuns who refused to abandon their vows. His death at the hands of the system he used to butcher an entire nation was turned against him, and no one mourned his demise. This class is the most despised class of people from both the traditionalist right and Marxist left because of their actions such as these, and is why they need to be politically repressed with revolutionary fervor. These men are necessary for the function of the empire economically, but always destructive and bent towards chaos to overthrow ancient orders. Julius Ever wrote on this in his analysis of the Great War.
With World War I, the Russian Revolution, and World War II, the decisive events of the last age are ushered in. In 1914, the Central Empires still represented within the Western world a remainder of the feudal and aristocratic Europe, despite the undeniable aspects of militaristic hegemonism and some questionable collusions with capitalism, especially in Wilhelm's Germany. The coalition against the Central Empires was expressly a coalition of the Third Estate against the residual forces of the Second. It was a coalition of nationalisms and the great democracies more or less inspired by the immortal principles of the French Revolution, which some people wanted to replicate on an international scale, and which fact did not prevent the humanitarian and patriotic ideology from playing into the hands of a greedy and supremacist high finance. As few other times before, World War I displays the traits of a conflict not between states and nations, but rather between ideologies of different castes. The immediate and willfully pursued results of this war were destruction of the German monarchy and Catholic Austria. The indirect results were the collapse of the Tsar's empire, the communist revolution, and the establishment in Europe of a socio-political situation that was so chaotic and contradictory as to contain all the premises of a new conflagration. Julius Evola: Revolt against the Modern World.
Finally, we end upon the Fourth Estate, the proletariat, the peasant, the serf. These are the majority caste of any civilization, the people disposed to the art of physical labor. Their labor is where they meet their fulfillment from it. In the times of peace, they are the most stable part of the traditional world. When they are rallied into a mob, and if they are given organization by demagogues, typically from men of the Third Estate, they can be the most anarchic and destructive force known to man. Nationalist, socialist, fascism, Marxism, all come from these ideas of a general will, a common demos, and creating common collectives, with drone-like membership led by intellectuals, artists, and idealists of the folk. In a way, when liberals maintain the position that the collectivists are all the same, because of similarities in their animating spirit of being movements of the Fourth Estate, and tend to lend to the masses and have disdain for atomized individualism. Stalin, for instance, had disdain for the type of man he called the rootless cosmopolitan, and that is what he described liberals and their mindset of being detached from the rest of their common man, is why ideologies like National Socialism, Marxism, and Fascism have disdain for the Third Estate. In Christianity, the disdain of the money powers and the men who make it their life's goal of procurement of wealth, notably in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verse 23 and 24, quote, "Then said Jesus unto his disciples, Verily I say unto you, that a rich man shall hardly enter into the kingdom of heaven. And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven."
Metternich saw all the most essential points, that revolutions are not spontaneous outbursts or mass phenomena, but rather artificial phenomena that are provoked by forces that have the same function in the healthy body of people and states that bacteria have in the generation of diseases in the human body. That revolution was essentially an international event, and that the individual revolutionary phenomena are only localized and partial manifestations of the same subversive current of global proportions. Metternich also saw very clearly the concatenation of the various degrees of revolution. Liberalism and constitutionalism unavoidably pave the way for democracy, which in turn paves the way for socialism, which in turn paves the way for radicalism, and finally for communism. The entire liberal revolution of the Third Estate only being instrumental in preparing the way for the revolution of the Fourth Estate, which is destined to inexorably remove the representatives of the former and their world as soon as they have completed their assignment as the avant-garde in charge of opening a breach. This is why Metternich saw folly in coming to terms with subversion. If you give it a hand, it will soon take the arm and the rest of the body as well. Having understood the revolutionary phenomenon in its unity and essence, Metternich indicated the only possible antidote, a similar supranational front of all traditional states and the establishment of a defensive and offensive league of all the monarchs of divine right. This what his Holy Alliance was meant to be. World War II was this configuration. In this war the ideological lineups were not as precise as in the previous war. States like Germany and Italy that had appropriated the authoritarian and anti-democratic idea and had sided against left-wing forces, by their initially upholding in this war the right of nations in need of living space as they struggled against world plutocracy, almost appeared to espouse Marxism on the international plane by giving to the war they waged the meaning of an insurrection of the Fourth Estate against the great democracies in which the power of the Third Estate had been consolidated. But overall, and especially after the United States entered into the conflict, what appeared to be a prevalent ideology was one that had already shaped World War I, namely, the crusade of the democratic nations bent on liberating the people still enslaved to what were looked upon as backward political systems. The latter was destined rapidly to become a mere facade with regard to new political alignments. In their alliance with the Soviet Union, which was willed in order to bring down the powers of the Axis, and in their persevering in a mindless radicalism, the democratic powers repeated the error of those who think they can employ with impunity and for their own purposes the forces of subversion, and who, by following a fatal logic, ignore the fact that when the forces representing two different degrees of subversion meet or clash, those corresponding to the higher degree will eventually prevail. In reality it can clearly be seen how, from the Soviet side, the democratic crusade had been conceived only as a preparatory stage in the global plans of communism. The end of the war marked the end of the hybrid alliance, and the real outcome of World War II was the elimination of Europe as a main protagonist in world politics, the sweeping away of any intermediate form, and the opposition of America and Russia as supranational exponents of the forces of the Third and Fourth Estates, respectively. Julius Evola: Revolt against the Modern World. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them who relations of society. Karl Marx: The Communist Manifesto.
These castes are at the end of the day all required for the organic function of the traditional state. That would be the one of the Ghibelline ideals. All the castes would have one origin point from their unity, the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor. Unlike Guelphism/theocracy, or rule by the First Estate, aristocratic republicanism, or rule by the Second Estate, liberalism, or rule by the Third Estate, or socialism or anarchism, or which is rule by the Fourth Estate. The Holy Roman Emperor unifies these forces, making them subject to him and incorporating all their animating spirits into a whole. That is the way of the traditional society in an imperial understanding of the world.
The fact that the feudal world of personality and of action did not exhaust the deepest possibilities of medieval man was proven by the fact that his fides was able to develop in a sublimated form and be purified into the universal. Such was the form that had the empire as its reference point. The empire was perceived as a superpolitical reality, an institution of supranational origin that formed one power with the divine kingdom. While in the empire the same spirit that shaped the individual feudal and regal units continued to act, its peak was the emperor, who was regarded not as a mere man, but rather as a deus homo totus deificatus et sanctificatus, aderandus quia praesel princeps et summus est. The God-man is completely deified and sanctified, to be worshipped because he is the prince and supreme, according to the characteristic expression of the time. Thus, the emperor embodied the function of a center in the eminent sense of the word and demanded from his subjects and from the feudal lords a spiritual acknowledgement similar to what the Church claimed for herself in order to realize a higher European traditional unity. Julius Evola: Revolt against the Modern World. The castes, more than defining social groups, defined functions and typical ways of being and acting. The correspondence of the functional natural possibilities of the single individual to any of these functions determined his or her belonging to the corresponding caste. Thus, in the duties toward one's caste, each caste was traditionally required to perform specific duties. The individual was able to recognize the normal explication as well as the development and the chrism of his or her own nature within the overall order imposed from above. This is why the caste system developed and was applied in the traditional world as a natural, agreeable institution based on something that everybody regarded as obvious, rather than on violence, oppression, or on what in modern terms is referred to as social injustice. By acknowledging his own nature, traditional man knew his own place, function, and what would be the correct relationship with both superiors and inferiors. Hence, if a bourgeoisie did not acknowledge the authority of a warrior noble, Or if a warrior noble did not uphold his superiority in regards to a bourgeoisie, worker or slave, this was not so much considered a fault but as the result of ignorance. A hierarchy was not a device of the human will but a law of nature, and as impersonal a physical law as that according to which a lighter fluid floats on top of a denser fluid, unless an upsetting factor intervenes. There was a firmly upheld principle according to which those who want to institute a process at variance with human nature cannot make it function as an ethical system. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world.
The ideal for the empire is the unity of all castes towards the greater mission of empire, and doesn't tolerate dissent of the castes, and that way of thinking is anathema to the empire. I'm going to take an example from the snippet of the Holy Roman Empire known as Brandenburg Prussia, who being a frontier territory developed this very rugged form of unity of all castes that was called Prussian Socialism by the German historiographer Oswald Spengler in his essay, Prussian Socialism, in quotes.
In contrast to these two, the German Revolution grew out of a theory. German, or more precisely, Prussian instinct declares that power belongs to the totality. The individual serves the totality, which is sovereign. The king, as Frederick the Great maintained, is only the first servant of his people. Each citizen is assigned as in the totality. He receives orders and obeys them. This is authoritarian socialism as we have known it since the 18th century. It is essentially non-liberal and anti-democratic, at least when compared with English liberalism and French democracy. But it is also clear that the Prussian instinct is anti-revolutionary. The task of transposing the state organism from the 18th to 19th century, a process that might be described as liberal and democratic but in an entirely different, Prussian sense, was one for organizational talent. Oswald Spengler, Prussian Socialism. Simply stated, the best regime is monarchy. St. Thomas Aquinas.
Ghibellinism, as mentioned prior, isn't an ideology, but a worldview that places the emperor as the embodiment of God on earth, and is by right wields the power to rule as God's regent upon this earth. But being God's regent on this earth is his primary responsibility to the protection of his subjects as his divine mandate. The institutions that achieve this aim are that of the monarch's design based on desire, vision, or simple necessity. There is no such thing as a perfect formula for governance. You cannot establish a centralized state on the Russian-Siberian frontier, and it must be left to Cossacks to rule in the Tsar's name, and owes exclusive loyalty to the person of the Russian monarch. In the German Empire, they had a long and treasured history of small, centralized, and fervently independent German states, ruled by German princes of various titles, from kings such as from Bavaria, Prussia, and Württemberg, to principalities such as the surviving Principality of Liechtenstein. Because of this, the German Kaiser, or Emperor, was an Emperor of Germany, because that derived personal ownership over all the lands of which is Germany. Instead, the title was German Emperor, as the King of Prussia was elected by the German princes to be the Emperor, a first amongst equals, as to say. This was the point that at German unification, they didn't even unify all the armies. The Kingdom of Bavaria maintained its own independent army from the rest of the imperial army, and recognized the German emperor as a supreme warlord, but were not subject to the emperor's army. It harkens back to the times of the Ghibelline emperor. In the times of the First Reich, or more commonly known as the Holy Roman Empire. For the essay, even though I advocate for Ghibellinism, I do say it is the ideal, and now we are approaching the formal. For this, I shall lift directly from the constitution of the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, the Second Reich, better known as the German Empire. From my view, the German Empire, along with the Austrian Empire to a lesser degree, was the last example of the Ghibelline ideal to exist upon this earth, only to be destroyed by the forces of liberal subversion at the end of 1918, little more than a century ago.
The presidency of the Federation belongs to the King of Prussia, who bears the name of German Emperor. The Emperor has to represent the Reich internationally, to declare war and to conclude peace in the name of the Reich, to enter into alliances and other treaties with foreign powers, to accredit and to receive ambassadors. The consent of the Federal Council is necessary for the declaration of war in the name of the Reich, unless an attack on the territory or the coast of the Federation has taken place. In so far as treaties with foreign states have reference to affairs which, according to Art. 4, belong to the jurisdiction of the legislation, the consent of the Federal Council is requisite for their conclusion, and the sanction of the Reichstag for their coming into force. The German Imperial Constitution, Article 11.
The Holy Roman Emperor, as the German Emperor reigned, he was the final decision-maker and instigator of all policies of the empire besides for domestic law, which even then imperial decrees were used if law by the Federal Council or Bundesrat or the Imperial Diet, the Reichstag, couldn't make appropriate legislation for the empire. Many Americans will see the similarity towards the American executive called the President. That's because the President, or the presiding officer, fills the shoes rather haphazardly of a traditional head of state. The monarch, the head of state, in every nation is that of the embodiment of the state, its symbol, and also where the state derives its total authority, and the government is separated from him but derives their authority from the personality of the emperor, as the next article states.
The emperor has the right to summon, to open, to prorogue and to close both the Federal Council and the Reichstag. The German Imperial Constitution, Article 12.
The Federal Council, or the upper house, like the United States Senate, are representatives of their respective states with different numbers based on population. In the German Empire, they were sent by the different states' princes to represent the interests of the individual territories of the German Empire, and was a reflection of the Imperial Diet at Regensburg of the Holy Roman Empire, which made the legislation of the Holy Roman Empire and represented all the estates that paid taxes to the imperial throne, which typically was of the first, second, and third estate. Most men of the fourth estate did not pay taxes. That went to the imperial throne in the time of the Holy Roman Empire. Since the invention of universal taxes, as the state needed to grow in the development of history, eventually the fourth estate began paying taxes and subsequently were given representation themselves, but the lines between the third and fourth estate would be blurred a bit in the Reichstag or Imperial Diet. What you saw would be men of the third estate, or the merchant caste, who can run political campaigns and have the wealth to take periods from work or even fund their own campaigns. They would typically sway men of the fourth estate to vote for them to be sent as representatives to the Reichstag. The only men who could vote were non-aristocratic men who were of the age of 25 and had served their mandatory military service. The Reichstag, despite being elected, wasn't independent, for the Reichstag existed only by the divine grace of the emperor, and can be disbanded or called as needed. The Reichstag and Federal Council was governed and organized not by a prime minister of their choosing, but an imperial chancellor appointed by the emperor himself, with typically the imperial chancellor was a man of no political party, such as the great Chancellor Prince Bismarck.
The presidency of the Federal Council and the direction of the business belongs to the Reichskanzler, who is to be appointed by the emperor. The Reichskanzler can be represented, on his giving written notification thereof, by any other member of the Federal Council. The German Imperial Constitution, Article 15. The Reichstag has the right to propose laws within the competency of the Reich, and to forward petitions which have been addressed to it either to the Federal Council or to the Reichskanzler. The German Imperial Constitution, Article 23.
As mentioned earlier, all men in the empire are required to serve a term of mandatory military service. As in this age of industrial warfare, we have known since the Great War of 1914 to 1918. This has nothing to do with the Ghibelline ideal, as that was the time of the warrior caste, and warfare being relegated to the emperor, princes, knights, and men-at-arms, where per capita it costs much more to equip a man of war than a soldier of the 20th century. It was also expected that all men of the warrior caste funded their own arms and armor. As an example, all knights were landholders and farmers, farmed their fief to fund their ability to fight wars. Mind you, this came at the end of training that lasted since adolescence to early adulthood, and had to be sponsored by higher men of the warrior caste, such as counts, princes, dukes, kings, bishops, the Roman pontiff, or even the emperor. Since the industrial age, mass production and levy en masse became major winning factors in wars, as first seen in Napoleonic times, to a lesser degree, but at its most bloody during the World Wars, where conscript armies were used in the millions to fight truly titanic wars. This is why, if the Ghibelline ideal is to be revived and the Holy Roman Empire to be the great defender of Christendom under the temporal reign of the emperor, he needs a great army at his back, who will follow in their divine mission.
Every German is liable to military duty, and in the discharge of this duty no substitute shall be accepted. Every German capable of bearing arms shall belong for 7 years to the standing army, as a rule from the end of his 20th to the beginning of his 28th year. During the next 5 years he shall belong to the National Guard, Landwehr, of first summons, and then to the National Guard of second summons until the 31st day of March of the year in which he reaches the age of 39 years. During the period of service in the standing army, the members of the cavalry and of the mounted field artillery are required to serve the first 3 years in unbroken active service. All other forces are required to give the first 2 years in active service. As regards the immigration of men belonging to the reserve, only those provisions shall be in force which apply to the emigration of members of the National Guard, Landwehr. The total land force of the empire shall form one army which shall be under the command of the emperor, in war and in peace. The German Imperial Constitution, Articles 57, 59 and 63.
Finally, unto the judiciary, which the Anglo nations such as Britain and the United States attempt to make their own institutions with the belief of absolute impartiality, and that they will assume the role of sole judges of the law. This idea is flawed from the onset, because if laws are made, then the judiciary can ignore them, picking and choosing the laws they enforce. In the traditional world, there was the concept of keeping the king's peace, his law. Oftentimes the monarch sat on trials as the supreme judge of the land. In Dante Alighieri's De Monarchia he writes,
"Wherever strife is a possibility, in that place must be judgment, otherwise imperfection would exist without its perfecting agent. This could not be, for God and nature are not wanting in necessary things. It is self-evident that between two princes, neither of whom owes allegiance to the other, controversy may arise either by their own fault or by the fault of their subjects. For such, judgment is necessary. And inasmuch as one owing no allegiance to the other can recognize no authority in him, for an equal cannot control an equal, there must be a third prince with more ample jurisdiction, who may govern both within the circle of his right. The prince will be or will not be a monarch. If he is, our purpose is fulfilled. If not, he will again have a coequal beyond the circle of his jurisdiction, and again a third prince will be required. And thus either the process will be carried to infinity, which is impossible, or that primal and highest judge will be reached, by whose judgments all disputes are settled mediately or immediately, and this judge will be monarch, or emperor. Monarchy is therefore indispensable to the world, and this truth the philosopher saw when he said, things have no desire to be wrongly ordered. Inasmuch as a multitude of princedoms is wrong, let there be one prince. Dante Alighieri de Monarchia. There's a man alone, Adolf Hitler, without family, without God. Why should he be human? Oh, without a doubt, he's sincere, but this very sincerity keeps him apart, out of touch, with men and realities. He builds legions, but he doesn't build a nation. A nation is created by families, a religion, traditions. It is made up out of the hearts of mothers, the wisdom of fathers, the joy and exuberance of children. Over there, an all-swallowing state, disdainful of human dignities and the ancient structure of our race, sets itself up in place of everything else. And the man who, alone incorporates in himself this whole state, has neither a god to honor, nor a dynasty to conserve, nor a past to consult. Kaiser Wilhelm II, 1938.
First and foremost, the ideals of the English and French Enlightenment are not men admired in Christendom. Fundamentally, the Holy Roman Empire was oriented upwards to the divine and didn't look down to the earth for its legitimacy. The Enlightenment mind attempts to derive the legitimacy of their state from an abstract ideal devoid from God, such as their version of a god called the popular will, or by natural law. The reasons as to why these illegitimate ideas is because it is reductionist and of the greatest and mediocrity of men. The undermines the natural rights for the great men to rule and for those without ability to follow. Second, it comes from the idea that man left without a mission of sacral and divine nature will be good. In reality, time and time again, when order ceased to reign, man devolves to his fallen instincts of the fall of Adam in the garden. Because of this, any authority who doesn't grasp the divine mission will lead its people to debauchery and sin, as seen in the United States, with the most unfettered access to pornography, prostitution in certain corners, hypergamous relationships operating like markets, rampant homosexuality, and degradation of the image of God. All these things are evil of modernity and tied to materialism of modern man. Christendom in the Holy Roman Empire had a ruling class that enforced the moral order. Man could be free without violating that divine order or God's law, for undisciplined man will devolve without the strong arm of greater men of true character and will to expound those virtues despite the popular will. When Christ came upon Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, and an aristocratic Roman, Pilate, who by most say he did not wish to see Christ crucified, but as custom on Passover, he was to release one prisoner. To attempt to prevent the crowd from slaying such a great man in his eyes as Jesus Christ, he brought out Barabbas, a Jewish murderer. The chief priest, of which Christ knew had been corrupted by them mixing their blood with lesser peoples, not of the tribe of Levi, had swayed the masses to slay Christ, whipping the men of the Fourth Estate into a democratic mob out for blood.
But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas, and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus which is called Christ? They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why, what evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water, and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person, see ye to it. Then answered all the people, and said, His blood be on us, and on our children. The Gospel of Matthew 27:20-25.
The masses need their morality dictated to them, and only by the servant of the divine, who rules in his name, for any declaration of the rights of men are only seen for what they are, the money changers of the temple that must be driven out by force. For when men strive for perfection of heaven, they shall shape the world in their mission.
Likewise, every son acts well and for the best when, As far as his individual nature permits, he follows in the footprints of a perfect father. As man and the son generate man, according to the second book of natural learning, the human race is the son of heaven, which is absolutely perfect in all its works. Therefore mankind acts for the best when it follows in the footprints of heaven, as far as its distinctive nature permits. Now, human reason apprehends most clearly through philosophy that the entire heaven in all its parts, its movements, and its motors, is controlled by a single motion, the primeme mobile, and by a single mover, God. Then, if our syllogism is correct, the human race is best ordered when in all its movements and motors it is controlled by one prince as by one mover, by one law as by one motion. On this account it is manifestly essential for the well-being of the world that there should exist a monarchy or unified principality, which men call the empire. This truth Boethius sighed for in the words, O race of men how blessed, did the love which rules the heavens rule likewise your minds. Dante Alighieri de Monarchia.
The concerns of civil rights in the time of the Kali Yuga, or Dark Age, has led to the degradation of the human form. The belief of freedom of speech gives the unpious man to blaspheme and damn his countrymen, filling their minds with evil thoughts. Freedom of religion is the freedom for heretics to destroy the unity of the one and holy Catholic Apostolic Church. Freedom of the press has allowed the proliferation of falsified media that undermines the natural hierarchy, mostly by the forces of finance against the forces of legitimate sovereignty. Underfinance usurp sovereignty and tradition for an anti-tradition. This has just been part of the regression of the natural caste as seen in the age of Faustian man, or the age that reflects one of the Faust, where man is in an endless pursuit of knowledge, wealth, and personal liberty, had thrown himself into the fires of hell for his soul to be torn to shreds by the forces of evil that preach endless liberation at the price.
Then a second collapse occurred as the aristocracies began to fall into decay and the monarchies to shake at the foundations. Through revolutions and constitutions they became useless institutions object to the will of the nation, and sometimes they were even ousted by different regimes. The principle characterizing this state of affairs was, the king reigns but he does not rule. Together with parliamentary republics, the formation of the capitalist oligarchies revealed the shift of power from the second caste, the warrior, to the modern equivalent of the third caste, the mercantile class. The kings of the coal, oil, and iron industries replaced the previous kings of blood and of spirit. Antiquity, too, sometimes knew this phenomenon in sporadic forms. In Rome and in Greece the aristocracy of wealth repeatedly forced the hand of the hierarchical structure by pursuing aristocratic positions, undermining sacred laws and traditional institutions, and infiltrating the militia, priesthood, or consulship. In later times what occurred was the rebellion of the communes and the rise of the various medieval formations of mercantile power. The solemn proclamation of the rights of the Third Estate in France represented the decisive stage, followed by varieties of bourgeois revolution of the third caste, which employed liberal and democratic ideologies for its own purposes. Correspondingly, this era was characterized by the theory of the social contract. At this time the social bond was no longer a fides of a warrior type based on relationships of faithfulness and honor. Instead, it took on a utilitarian and economic character. It consisted of an agreement based on personal convenience and on material interests that only a merchant could have conceived. Gold became a means and a powerful tool. Those knew how to acquire it and to multiply it. Capitalism, high finance, industrial trusts, behind the appearances of democracy, virtually controlled political power and the instruments employed in the art of opinion making. Aristocracy gave way to plutocracy, the warrior, to the banker and industrialist. The economy triumphed on all fronts. Trafficking with money and charging interest, activities previously confined to the ghettos, invaded the new civilization. According to the expression of W. Zombert, in the promised land of Protestant Puritanism, Americanism, capitalism, and the distilled Jewish spirit coexist. It is natural that given these congenial premises, the Niter Briore Zebtuvs of secularized Judaism saw the ways to achieve world domination open up before them. In this regard, Karl Marx wrote, "What are the mundane principles of Judaism? Practical necessity and the pursuit of one's own advantage. What is its earthly god? Money." The Jew has emancipated himself in a typically Jewish fashion not only in that he has taken control of the power of money, but also in that through him, money has become a world power and the practical Jewish spirit has become the spirit of the Christian people. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. The God of the Jews has become secularized and has become the God of the earth. The exchange is the true God of the Jews. In reality, the codification of the traffic with gold as a loan changed with interest, to which the Jews had been previously devoted since they had no other means through which they could affirm themselves, may be said to be the very foundation of the acceptance of the aberrant development of all that is banking, high finance, and pure economy, which are spreading like a cancer in the modern world. This is the fundamental time in the age of the merchants. Julius Evola revolt against the modern world.
Capitalism and its culture-breaking spirit is the anathema to Catholic social teaching. Usury is inflation of the money supply through credit and market manipulation. It requires a class of people who make profit not by production, but by theft of the common man. These social situations have led to only one result when the bourgeoisie society cannibalizes itself: revolt of the workers who offer labor for its prosperity, and when their labor ceases to be able to provide for their wives and their kin, and they see the decadent bourgeois demean them and restrict their lives from ability to live, depression and anger stirs soon. They find their natural leaders, such as a Lenin or Trotsky, who is able to bring the form of anger to action, and then there is no stopping it. What needs to be done, and what was the reality of Christendom, was the greatest distribution of wealth to the greatest extent mankind has ever known. Wealth wasn't weighed by numbers and currency, but by hard assets, production, land ownership, and value of your word and honor as a man. At the time, this most just age was referred to as the feudal age. The ancient model adapted for today is what is referred to as distributism. The details are too many to account for, and are out of the parameters of this work. In basics, it was formed by his most holiest Holy Father, Pope Leo XIII, in his papal encyclical Rerum Novarium, where he officially denounced capitalism, usury, and the practices of the modern day. He advocated for the distribution of the means of production, ending of large trusts and monopolies of capital, ending of the modern banking houses and institutions of control by finance through debt, the redistribution of lands as it was in feudal times when farmers would keep around 90% of their produce he tilled from the land and on average only worked 10 hours a week. The ancient guilds that protected the laborer and were able to elevate the peasant by training crafts and not have predatory institutions of universities and trade schools, with high costs being a barrier for natural talents to develop and fester. Growing to master craftsmen with rewards for quality artisanship and disdain for mass production, and the universalizing and reductionist effects of the capitalist mass production. It isn't as short-sighted as the Bolshevik worldview that says money in itself is the evil factor, but the capitalist lust for it, the greed and the usury which is a byproduct of it. The capitalist has its place and is necessary to facilitate the market of which the production is sold to men of other crafts, and to procure he does not produce himself. Profit is a byproduct of the capitalist mission, not of its hoarding and exclusion of the workers to have. For the worker must thrive when he is called to take a wife and bring forth the next generation. If the worker cannot even pay for the roof over his head, how can you expect him to feed his children? Pretty soon you will get the modern world where the ability for people to have children and then thrive is excluded to only the richer of men in the society. In prior years, a single income man had the ability to purchase a house and pay it off in a few years. Now, with the capitalist centralization of wealth, stagnation of wealth with inflation, which is the theft of the common man of his earnings, followed by the inflation of housing costs, apartments, and costs of land, period, are causing a generational melancholy that is self-evident to all of age in these times. When class struggle is at foot in the gladiatorial predatory system of economics such as capitalism, the material conditions for divinity and unity of the empire cannot exist. That's why it is declared capitalism is the enemy of Christendom and of mankind as a whole. The Holy Roman Empire and the emperor are not subjects to money interests but to God, and so be their subjects. Those who submit themselves to Christ and the covenant shall be rewarded with an emperor who will protect them and a pontiff to lead them spiritually. Those who refuse shall not have the privilege of the empire and the Ghibelline emperors. If we can ever arise from these dark times of domination by the and restoration of the true order of Christendom, may it be with the emperor's light and the mission of the Holy Roman Empire. Because of the nature of this essay being so alien to the modern zeitgeist, the brevity of it cannot do justice to what it advocates, and is more to encourage further inquiries into the deep lores of the traditional world. The objective was not to evangelize by compromise, but to let more people know that the current world order isn't the default of the world, but a deviation of the forms more natural to our race. The traditional world didn't think of this world as the totality of existence, but a byproduct of the greater powers of the universe, whether they be gods or singular God of the one whose legitimacy is recognized from the premise of this essay, and was the order of which ruled Europe from Saint Emperor Constantine to Blessed Emperor Karl of Austria, informed by their holy advisors, the Roman pontiffs, who inherited their legitimacy from Christ's apostle Saint Peter. When you base your worldview on the materialism in this life, and do not submit yourself to the one who created you, then in the next life I cannot say how the Almighty will judge those who sought the world only for their cardinal pleasures. Liberalism, Marxism, fascism, Masonry, anarchism, all these are materialistic doctrines and die with their followers, yet drives them to murderous frenzies, not because they are mad, but fundamentally there is evil amongst their ideologies, and fallen entities that guide their followers to ruinous ends. That is why you must ask the question, has liberalism only been brought about through the barrel of a gun, communism brought only about through the rampage of a mob, fascism only by the total control of the state, anarchism only by the slaying of priests and raping of nuns? Why is the mind of the modernist so corrupted when they see an unideological spiritual and ordered civilization as something to be torn down for personal liberation? The sight of families in matrimony, young children at play in the town square, the farmer left to his business without the concern that his leaders don't have his interests or morals at mind, that his leaders don't only profess loyalty to the same God, but are united in mission to the same God to expand his kingdom. I know these are ideals, and reality could often be more dirty, but if you strive to reflect the kingdom of heaven on earth, then you will have a greater world. That is the Ghibelline ideal, and the ancient and enduring mission of the Holy Roman Empire.